Alright everyone, so welcome back. This is chapter 52 and we're taking a look at now talking about geographic distribution, why we see certain species where they are. And that's a big question that a lot of ecologists ask. Where are these species found and why are they there? What they're really asking is the dispersion or the distribution of organisms sort of away from these centers of very high population density or from where we know they kind of originate to spreading out from there. And this dispersion really contributes to seeing organisms, or even now seeing distant relatives of long-time ancestral species into different places in the environment. All right, we as humans, we know our area of origin was in the middle of Africa, and yet we now see human populations across the globe. And because of evolution, we look a little different. Socially, we act a little different. Well, organisms from the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, all kind of do that as well. So typically one of this line of questioning starts to be to ask, well, why don't we see a particular species in a particular area? And then they kind of go through a line of questioning similar to what you see in the figure there in terms of what limits their distribution. Is it a behavioral thing? Is it because of biotic factors? Are there other predators or disease or parasitism that keep them from being in a particular zone? Or is it abiotic? Or is it some combination of all of the above? And so that's really where they start kind of digging in and looking from a maybe ecological or community or population line of questioning to look at all of this. So in studying the geographic distribution of organisms, we really start to recognize that there's certainly global patterns. All right, we know those a lot more like our biomes, but there's also regional patterns within those biomes. Why we'll get certain organisms in your deserts here in the southwest of the US versus different organisms we'll see in, say, the Sahara, which is over in Africa. All right, both desert biomes, but we'll see different organisms within that. And it really comes down to the interactions between organisms and their environment, and that's going to be what limits where they can live. So you're going to have limiting factors, whether they're biotic or abiotic, that are going to keep those organisms within certain ranges and not elsewhere. And it can be anything from the climate to the amount of water available to those ideas of like competition and predation, parasitism, and those sorts of things. But it can also just be geological features. If you remember, and we'll come back to this in evolution, all of the continents used to be together in that supercontinent Pangaea, but as the Pangaea started breaking apart and we had continental drift, obviously the oceans are going to give us major barriers. Those organisms that couldn't fly over the water no longer could cross. All right, and so we see organisms here in Africa that are similar to organisms here in South America, and so we know that there's probably some sort of connection, evolutionarily speaking, but they could no longer cross that barrier, and so they've evolved to be different species now. But it can also be something as simple as deserts or mountain ranges or the Grand Canyon, for instance. Certain organisms, unless they can fly over the Grand Canyon, are not going to be able to get across that. There's a river in the way. And so eventually, over time, evolution takes its role and gives us different species. All right, and so that's going to give us distinct plant and animal communities in different biographical regions within the globe, as well as just climate and all of that sort of idea as well. However, we do see organisms that expand their range over time. So the egret here was first discussed about in South America in the 1800s, and over time you can see that they've spread out. All right, so here's some of our earlier times, the 50s, 40s here, all right, 1930s here, but they're expanding down the coast of Chile and all that in South America, and coming up all the way up into lower regions of Canada. All right, and so they can distribute themselves over time as they expand what sort of was their point of origin, their original range. All right, and over time, it's possible that long distance dispersion, something like you seeing there in the picture, can lead to adaptive radiation. All right, and the classic example of adaptive radiation are your Galapagos finches. All right, you get that ancestral species who came from South America onto the Galapagos as those plate tectonics and continental drift sort of moved the Galapagos further off the coast to the point where they could no longer get to the mainland. They start spreading out among those islands and they adapt, all right, in sort of a radial pattern based on the needs and the available food sources that they had, and that's where we get all those different beak sizes from. So our species distributions really are a result of both ecological interactions as well as evolution. So we can talk about these distributions from an ecological standpoint, sort of what they're calling ecological time here, which is, at least in Earth history, a kind of minute by minute time frame, not literally minute by minute, but shorter time frames of interactions between organisms and their environment. A lot of what we can study in ecological studies here. So a couple of months, maybe a couple of years of looking at how these organisms interact between each other and within their environment, and how that's sort of driving their distribution, versus looking at evolutionary time where we're talking thousands of years and many, many generations over time, and how do those adaptations through natural selection give us the distribution that we see, or the different species eventually that we see. Kind of like talking about those finches. All right. And then, of course, we always have to worry about what we call species transplants. Invasive species is really what we're getting at here. And these organisms are relocated from their original distributions, their original areas, and if they're successful, where they're able to survive and reproduce, we can start talking about the fact that although we wouldn't see them there originally, naturally, there were other barriers in the way. All right, so their potential range where they could survive is much bigger than what we would actually see. So there's obviously predators in the way. There may be geological features, mountains, rivers in the way. And so it's not that they can't survive elsewhere, not that their range couldn't be bigger, but there's other factors limiting where they're located. The best example is what we see with the stink bugs. All right, so these guys are, or at least originally, were kind of kept to Asia, Southeast Asia, and now they're here in the US, particular problem locally for us. So they were sort of confined to Southeast Asia until they ended up on a shipping freighter and ended up here. All right, and they're able to thrive and become such a nuisance because they're missing their natural predators. They're missing those natural pieces that were originally keeping their actual range kind of constricted, and that's all gone here. So their potential range is blown up. It has exploded because they don't have those natural constricting, limiting factors here. And because of that, they often, as any invasive species does, becomes very disruptive to the communities, the ecosystems in which they're introduced, because their natural confines, their natural predators, diseases, what have you, aren't in place, and so their populations just explode. They go through exponential growth. All right, nothing's there to keep them in check. So, what are some of the reasons that they don't typically see organisms in their full potential range? Well, it usually has to do with some sort of selective behavior in their environment. All right, and those selections, those limiting factors can be anything from abiotic, there's not enough water there, there's not enough minerals, whatever it may be, or there's geographic regions that are, geographic features that are in the way, the mountains, the rivers, that kind of thing. But a lot of it can be biotic factors. So interactions with other species, certain diseases or certain parasites keep them from realizing that full potential range because they're susceptible to a certain disease or a certain parasite. The predation and the herbivory is what's going on here in this particular figure. If you take a look in your textbook, they go into some more detail, but basically they're looking at the seaweed cover, right, which is what's going on here over time, and they control this experiment by either both having these sea urchins and these limpets, which are mussels that eat seaweed. And when both of those organisms are present, you can see that the cover is very, very low. All right, and so the question really was, all right, which is causing the seaweed cover to kind of be kept in check? Is it these mussels or the sea urchins? And there was some suggestion that it was the sea urchins, that they would just go in, they would eat the crap out of the seaweed and just knock the population down to almost nothing, which is a big problem out in the Northwest, all right, in their kelp forests, because they were seeing, as they were kind of killing off the sea otter population, all right, not necessarily on purpose, but from the fishing boats and all that sort of stuff coming in and out, that their kelp forests were going nuts. Well, those sea otters are a keystone species. They really go after these sea urchins, and when the sea otters aren't there to keep the sea urchin population in check, the sea urchins come in and just mow the whole seaweed population to nothing. So what they did is they did a controlled experiment. Both of these guys are present in our seaweed populations all the way down here to almost nothing. If we allowed just the limpets in, then you really don't get much of a change. All right, you get a little bit more cover, which is what this green one is here. All right, but if we take just the sea urchins out, well, the limpets are controlling the population to a degree, but it's a much, much more explosive population growth. You take both of them out of the picture, and we get even more. All right. So what they're coming out of this is saying that this sea urchin population has the biggest control over our seaweed population. Having both species there controls it even more. All right, but just having that herbivory and that predation of plants really can control the distribution of a particular species. And then, of course, there's competition. So obviously between these two species, there's some competition going on. And removing both of them causes the seaweed population to go even higher in growth, but that the sea urchin population certainly keeps the limpets under control as well.